All right, I think we will get started. We have quite a few participants joining us. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Abigail Beeman. I'm a reporter with Global National based here in Ottawa. I'm also a member of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship Committee. I'll be your MC tonight. Confession, it's my first time emceeing a virtual event. It's obviously CHES's first time hosting Holocaust Education Month virtually. We wish that we could all be together in one room, and one day we will do that again, but I can promise you that tonight we have a wonderful virtual program for you. As we work to adjust and live with our new reality during this pandemic, one thing that remains the same is the pressing need for effective and strong Holocaust education to help combat anti-Semitism. So we thank you for joining us and supporting our efforts to deliver that. We have a wonderful turnout tonight with about 100 people joining us so far, and I know more are joining along the way. You'll hear much more about CHES's work in our film that we are about to premiere. And you'll hear more about the importance of Holocaust education in the 21st century from our two speakers. But first, I would like to start us off by introducing CHES's founder and director, who will say a few words to begin, and that's Mina Cohen. Mina.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special webinar. I want to extend a special welcome to the survivors and their families who are joining us, and to our guest speakers, Professor Cotler and Dr. Patt. Faced with the COVID pandemic, we too had to cancel live activities and find a new way to deliver meaningful programs that honor the lessons and legacies of the Holocaust. Tonight's program is an example of such an effort. But before I continue, I want to invite Dr. Deidre Butler, the director of the Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies, to say a few welcoming words. Deidre, please.
Thank you, Mina. The Max and Tessie Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University promotes scholarly inquiry into all aspects of the Jewish experience from ancient times to the present. A little over 6 years ago, Mina came to my home to talk about building a Center for Holocaust Education at Carleton. We were excited to imagine year-round programming, partnering with survivors and second generation, bringing together faculty, researchers, students, and the community to remember and educate. Mina and I are passionate people, and I knew that we could do great things together. But I could not have imagined what she and her team have done together in 5 short years. As you will see from the film that documents CHES's proud achievements, Mina and her extraordinary team have exceeded our grandest hopes and continue to point towards a future of remembrance, scholarly excellence, and dynamic education. The Zelikovic Center and Carleton University are honored to work with Mina and her team and everyone at CHES. And I want to personally thank all of you for the amazing work that you've done. Yasher Koach, I'm so happy to share this celebration with you and the work that we'll do together for the future.
Thank you, Deidre, for your kind words. The Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship was established 5 years ago on the eve of Kristallnacht. It was then, and it is now, a symbolic affirmation of the center's commitment to honor our parents and grandparents who survived, to remember those who perished, and to share the lessons and legacy of the Holocaust. The launch of Holocaust Education Month in Ottawa is traditionally held on November 9 or 10th in memory of Kristallnacht. This year is no difference. We gather here on the eve of Kristallnacht, a date that marks the transition of Nazi policy vis-a-vis Jews and is considered the beginning of the Holocaust. This year, as we mark 82 years to Kristallnacht, we are witnessing an unprecedented increase in anti-Semitism and many other forms of hatred, all of which are frequently marked by transition from hateful words to acts of violence. The Holocaust is teaching us that we cannot accept this reality, but must fight it. As education is a key part of fighting anti-Semitism, we are left with an urgent need to redouble our efforts in the field of Holocaust education. This evening, as Abigail already said, but I'll repeat it for those who joined recently or shortly, consists of two parts. The first part includes the screening of a short documentary film, Voices from the Past, the Present, and the Future. The film reviews CHES achievements and contributions to Holocaust education since its establishment 5 years ago. The second part is dedicated to the important task of Holocaust education today. Before we turn our attention to viewing the film, I want to remind the audience that CHES is a small, volunteer-driven organization. While you're looking at the center's achievement in the past 5 years, consider and imagine what we can accomplish in the next 5 years with adequate support. I would like to thank the members of CHES committee for the effort they put into realizing this project, and to our capable filmmaker, Yolanda Papini-Polak. Yolanda is here with us tonight. I want to thank you, Yolanda, for all your hard work, dedication, and time in creating this film in the short time that we had to do it. Yolanda in her work combines her love for history, art, and human rights. Thank you so much, Yolanda, for doing this for us. We appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Yolanda. I just wanted you to see her. Let's now turn to Voices from the Past, the Present, and the Future.
The more people know about the past, the better
prepared
they are
for the
future.
My name is Mina Cohen, and I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship at the Zelikovich Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University.
Mina Cohen said, we want to have a Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship. And with an open heart and with great enthusiasm, we both started this.
The Center for Holocaust Education and Scholarship is committed to transmitting the stories of the Holocaust to promote knowledge and understanding of its history and legacy.
We bring together academics, educators, survivors, students, and community members for year-round programming to combat prejudice and racism, to promote respect for diversity, social justice, and human rights.
Over the past 5 years, CHES organized, sponsored, and facilitated a wide range of outstanding programs to commemorate the Holocaust and its victims, to educate the public about the legacy of the Holocaust through exceptional programs and world-renowned experts, to reach out to teachers and students through unique workshops and survivors' visits to schools, to reach out to descendants of survivors to ensure the memory of the Holocaust continues to echo for generations to come.
It is the 5th year of operation, and I wanted to take a moment just to commemorate this, to thank the volunteers and staff and all those that have put such effort into teaching the Holocaust.
The Zelikovich Center is proud to provide a home for CHES and partner with Mina Cohen and the amazing committee of volunteers who do the hard work throughout the year to remember and educate.
The Germans came in and burned all the synagogues. So when I have seen this, I never went back home.
The SA men came, smashed all the windows, took away my father's partner to a concentration camp.
My parents, my paternal grandparents, and my maternal grandmother and other members of the family were deported to Auschwitz.
My mom and the two younger sisters went straight to the gas chamber.
Europe was divided into two types of countries. Countries in which Jews could not live and countries in which Jews could not enter.
As millions of Jewish men, women, and children were murdered, the world remained largely silent. Between 1947 and 1955, approximately 35,000 Holocaust survivors and their families were allowed to immigrate to Canada. A small group of about 200 Holocaust survivors settled in the Ottawa area.
CHES, by far, is one of the leading promoters of Holocaust remembrance, Holocaust awareness, and Holocaust education.
An organization like CHES teaches us what happens when we allow hatred to grow.
The work that CHES does is part of that process of repair. There's still very real brokenness in our world. There is still anti-Semitism in our world. There are still the root causes of hatred in our world.
Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die in Auschwitz.
CHES formally launched on November 8, 2015 to answer the need for ongoing Holocaust education and to combat the challenges of anti-Semitism. At the time, the nation's capital was the only major Canadian city without a Holocaust center.
In that short time, our small group of dedicated volunteers has delivered many exceptional educational programs in keeping with our mission.
Holocaust Education Month events feature inspiring programs and bring world-class speakers to Ottawa. In 2018, CHES hosted Professor Michael Berenbaum, a world expert in the study of the Holocaust.
We remember the bystanders who watched the synagogues burn, and we remember, sadly, that this was only the beginning of the end.
That same evening featured the globally celebrated Violins of Hope with virtuoso Niv Ashkenazi.
Each violin sounded and felt unique, and each had endured tremendous trauma. And it has been an honor getting to play on these instruments and giving them a new voice.
In 2019, CHES proudly hosted renowned Professor Emeritus and author Deborah Lipstadt. Speaking about her latest book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, Professor Lipstadt asserted, beyond the danger anti-Semitism poses for Jews, it poses a danger to democracy. The Descendants Symposium brings second and third generations of Holocaust survivors together.
Today, more children of survivors are using artistic and creative ways to tell the stories of their parents.
In 2018, with the support of the Azrieli Foundation, CHES hosted popular media personality, fashion maven, and author Jeannie Becker. Ms. Becker read excerpts from her book and shared her experiences as a daughter of a survivor.
What was it like to read your mother's words?
It's almost as though I think I channel her. It's coming from such a deep place. I really hear her voice in my head as I heard her telling these exact stories time and time again.
In 2020, Dr. Art Leader, a son of survivors and dedicated CHES member, was the guiding force behind a petition to the Canadian government, a call to action to address the growing challenges of anti-Semitism. CHES has been a leading force behind International Holocaust Remembrance Day in Ottawa. In 2017, a proclamation, the first by a mayor of Ottawa to address Holocaust remembrance, was accepted by CHES member Annette Wildgoose.
Through CHES, we have a tremendous outreach to the community, to all people.
CHES's work is enriched by strong relationships with embassies, the Canadian War Museum, and universities in the capital, as well as Holocaust museums and organizations across Canada and abroad. To mark the opening of the National Holocaust Monument, the event From Vision to Reality featured Dr. Robert Krell, held in partnership with the National Holocaust Monument Council.
Any knowledge or expertise I may have derives from being one of these children lucky enough to have survived and to have lived a life denied to so many hundreds of thousands of Jewish youngsters.
The last folio, Cultural Memoirs of Jewish Life in Slovakia with Holocaust descendant and acclaimed art photographer Yuri Deutsch, was brought to Ottawa in partnership with the Embassy of Slovakia. In cooperation with the National Arts Centre and its English Theatre, CHES held a tribute to John Hirsch, founder of the Manitoba Theatre Centre, head of CBC television drama, who arrived in Canada in 1947 through the War Orphan Project. CHES provided the first law enforcement workshop for the Ottawa Police Service in 2019. Anti-Semitism Then and Now offered tools to understand the roots of hatred, discuss means of recruitment, and identify young and vulnerable people. The Pop-Up Museum, a collaboration with the Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University, was created to showcase Holocaust artifacts owned by local survivors and descendants.
The Holocaust was a seminal event in Jewish history. And the only way that we can teach children today of the horrors of racism and bigotry is to understand the horrors, racism, and bigotry of the past.
My name is Kenra Morose. I am a teacher at Sir Robert Burton High School in Ottawa, Ontario, and I am a member of the CHES committee.
Kenra, like other teachers involved with CHES, recognizes today's young people are the leaders of tomorrow. She is determined to integrate Holocaust studies into her school's curriculum. Through its Speakers Bureau, CHES arranges for survivors to visit schools, to share their personal stories and discuss the dangers of anti-Semitism and racism.
I got to learn about the Holocaust through the eyes of a survivor, and that is something that most 10 or 11-year-olds don't get.
We had kids coming up to me and telling me openly that they didn't like Jews.
Somehow, when you put a face to it and you have the story, the students not just know that it is real, but also it makes them think about what prejudice, hatred can do.
Children understand that they shouldn't be looking at the exterior package, but rather whether someone has a good personality.
Such direct Holocaust education leaves lasting effects on students and helps create a more ethical society.
It made me want to live my life in a way that made sure that I was contributing to a more sustainable and inclusive and sort of moral world.
I wanted to let you know what an impact David Moskovich's talk had on our student body, staff, and our leadership team. It was an emotional day for all. His legacy and story will carry on for many years to come.
When I go to schools and I see children, I feel hopeful that the next generation is going to be much more aware.
I have had students talk about wanting to do more, being inspired by stories of the righteous among the nations.
CHES is the only organization in Ottawa offering ongoing teachers' workshops about the lessons and legacy of the Holocaust. Workshops that bring together educators, scholars, and survivors to engage in profound discussions on the danger of forgetting and the importance of remembrance. Through workshops and survivors' visits to schools, CHES reaches an average of 10,000 students a year.
We find that the number of teachers participating in our workshop is increasing every year, and so is the number of requests for visits by survivors to classrooms.
CHES recruits local grade 11 and 12 students and Holocaust survivors for the Ambassadors of Change program.
Frightening statistics have come out showing that 62% of millennials do not know that 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. And if people don't understand these facts, then it's bound to repeat itself.
CHES's unique school programs with March of the Living alumni and survivors helps carry the torch of remembrance for future generations. Each year, CHES honors a teacher who demonstrates exemplary work in Holocaust education with the Arie van Mansum Award, a tribute to a righteous Gentile from the Netherlands who lived in Ottawa.
I'm amazed at how horrified and appalled these teens are when they learn of the Holocaust.
A milestone and critical project for CHES the survivors' testimonials.
We took upon ourselves to record 10 Holocaust survivors who live in Ottawa. The testimonials were edited for use in the classroom. They are recognized by the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and are available on the websites of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem as well.
Younger generation should know what happened to us.
That stories need to be told because otherwise you give fodder to the Holocaust deniers.
It seems there still are people who don't believe that these horrible things could happen.
That was a calling for me to do that for the family who, a lot of them were murdered, and the ones who survived have been suffering the loss all their life.
So I asked thousands of speakers, give me an advice. What shall I do? It shall be never again.
Our responsibility must be to speak truth to power and hold power accountable to truth.
You can never do enough. The idea of leaving the past in the past simply doesn't exist.
With the survivors leaving us, they leave behind them a void, and we are struggling to find ways to fill this void. There is a need to improve Holocaust education in the school. Our goal is to embrace the new technology so we can reach the young kids who probably will not have an opportunity to meet a survivor and hear their stories.
My parents are both Holocaust survivors. It's our responsibility to bear witness and to pass the legacy of remembrance down to the future generations.
As descendants, I feel we have an obligation to speak out. We have an obligation to act.
I am calling on descendants of survivor and ask them to come forward and join our effort to teach the lessons and legacies of the Holocaust.
Without the help from everyone, we wouldn't exist.
Our goal is to create a permanent center in the city.
This takes time, which we're willing to give, but it also takes funding.
I feel that it's incumbent upon us to be proactive in terms financially to help organizations like CHES to be able to promote the education, to promote awareness of what happened.
The work done by this center must continue. It must continue with strength, and it must continue to go forward from generation to generation. Thank you all very much for your work. From strength to strength, Kol HaKavod.
Oh, I'm the first one this evening to say that I was muted when I didn't mean to be. So thank you so much for sharing in our video tonight. And I know you saw those credits and you saw Yolanda briefly, but just want to say thank you again to our filmmaker and to everybody involved in putting that film together and who were in the film as well. And I know that many of those people are joining us this evening. So thank you again. Before I introduce our two speakers this evening, I would just like to take a moment to explain the process for questions in this virtual environment that we're in. And I'm sure some of you have done this before, but at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. At any time while the speakers are speaking and you have a question, feel free to click that button and type in your question. Only we, the panelists and moderators, will be able to see your question, not everybody else in the audience. And then I will take questions at the very end of the evening. So after we've heard from both of our speakers, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So again, it's that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question there when it comes to you. And we should have time for several questions. So please feel free to do that as you're listening. We are so fortunate to have not one, but two phenomenal guest speakers tonight. You had actually a sneak peek of both of them. Both of them appeared in the film that you just watched, and they are both friends of CHES, and we feel very fortunate to have them both with us this evening. It's my honor to begin by introducing Professor Irwin Cotler. Professor Cotler is the founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg, Center for Human Rights. He's a professor emeritus in law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, as well as an international human rights lawyer. It's really an honor to hear him speak tonight about the importance of Holocaust education. Go ahead, Professor Cotler.
Expressing appreciation to Mina Cohen, to CHES, to your wonderful group of volunteers for yet another important commemorative Holocaust educative event, underpinned by a very moving and evocative film, and where we meet on the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht. I've often felt that the term Kristallnacht is a misleading, sanitizing term. For Kristallnacht was a state-orchestrated, racist, anti-Jewish, murderous pogrom. The precursor, as Mina Cohen said, the precursor and the pathway to the Holocaust, involving the burning and destruction of some 1,400 synagogues, the burning of Torah scrolls, the burning of books as a precursor to the burning of people, the plundering and pillaging of Jewish homes, of Jewish schools and businesses, the targeting and killing of some 100 Jews, the roundup and deportation of 30,000 Jews to the death camps. In a word, the burning, plundering, targeting, killing, rounding up, and deportation of people for only one reason, because they were Jews. The whole anchored in the Nuremberg race laws of 1935. And we commemorate this evening the 80th anniversary of those Nuremberg race laws, a backdrop to Kristallnacht, where Jews were excluded, delegitimized, disenfranchised as a matter of law, where Nazism was not only a racist philosophy, though that would be bad enough. It was a racist legal regime, itself anchored in the oldest, most enduring, most toxic, most lethal of hatreds, anti-Semitism. What then are the lessons for us 82 years later? What are the lessons on this, the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the worst and most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century? What are the lessons on this, the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Charter? What, in a word, are the lessons for Holocaust remembrance and education? The first is the danger of forgetting, the imperative of Zachor, of remembrance, of the Holocaust, as Elie Wiesel would remind us again and again, as a war against the Jews in which not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were targeted victims, where the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews is not just an abstract statistic, but as we say, it's such moments of commemoration. Unto each person there is a name. Each person is an identity. Each person is a universe. And as our sages remind us again and again, if you save a single person, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. Just as if you kill a single person, it is as if you have killed an entire universe. And so the overriding lesson of Zachor, that we are each, wherever we are, the guarantors of each other's destiny. The second is the danger of silence in the face of evil, where the silence indulgence, acquiescence of the Nuremberg race laws, of Kristallnacht, of the horrors of the Holocaust, of horrors too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, is, as Elie Wiesel again would remind us, complicity with evil itself. The third is the danger of state-sanctioned cultures of hate. For the Holocaust was made possible not only by the industry of death, but because of state-sanctioned incitement to hate. The Holocaust, as the Supreme Court of Canada would remind us, did not begin with the gas chambers. It began with words. These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of history. These, as the court put it, are the chilling facts of racism. Fourth is the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity. What makes Kristallnacht so unspeakable? What makes the horrors of the Holocaust so unspeakable is that these horrors were, in fact, preventable. Let me give you one moving example. It's anchored in the name of the righteous of the nation, Raoul Wallenberg, in tribute to whom and in memory of whom our organization is named. For Wallenberg demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. From mid-May to the beginning of July 1944, 440,000 Jews were deported to the death camps in Auschwitz. The cruelest, quickest, most efficient killing field in all of the Holocaust. Raoul Wallenberg arrived as a Swedish diplomat in the Swedish legation in Budapest in Budapest in mid-July 1944. And from then to the end of 1944, through bravery and lust, through ingenuity, courage, and commitment, Wallenberg, and organizing others in support with him, saved the remnant of 100,000 Jews. So what the whole bystander international community did not do, one person confronted evil and transformed history. And a final lesson, the danger of anti-Semitism. 1.3 million people were deported to the death camps in Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered in Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die in Auschwitz, and it remains the bloody canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And so may I close with a word to the survivors of the Holocaust. For you are the true heroes of humanity. You witnessed and endured the worst of inhumanity, but somehow you found in the depths of your own humanity the courage to go on, to rebuild your lives as you built your communities. And so it is with you, and because of you, and because of the righteous among the nations like Raoul Wallenberg, that we remember that each person has a name and an identity, that each person is a universe. And we remember, and this is not just a matter of rhetoric, but must be a commitment to action, that never again will we be indifferent to racism and hate, that never again will we be silent in the face of evil, that never again will we indulge racism and anti-Semitism, that never again will we be indifferent in the face of mass atrocity and the impunity that underpins it. But we will speak and we will act against racism, against hate, against anti-Semitism, against mass atrocity, against injustice, against always indifference. And this as part of the larger struggle for human rights and human dignity in our time. For in our time, more than ever, qui s'excuse, s'accuse, that whoever remains indifferent indicts himself or herself. And so, as I've said before, on commemorative events such as these, may this day be not only an act of remembrance, which it is, but may it be a remembrance to act, which it must be. V'im lo achshav matai, and if not now, when?
Thank you so much, Professor Cotler. Your message is so important and so moving, and it feels so strange not to hear the applause from the room, which I know is happening virtually, and not to be able to see people's faces. But I'm sure I speak for everyone to say thank you for that moving and important message, and for joining us here this evening. We are fortunate to be joined by a second speaker this evening. Dr. Avinoam Patt will speak to us about the obligations and challenges of teaching the Holocaust in the 21st century. Many of you may remember we were lucky to hear from Dr. Patt in 2017 as well, so we are thrilled to have him back this evening. Dr. Patt is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Until July 2019, he served as the Philip D. Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History at the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford, where he was also Director of the Museum of Jewish Civilization. Dr. Patt is an author and editor of a number of publications. He has 3 new ones that came out in 2020 and coming out in 2021 alone, and he has also been a contributor to several projects at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We welcome Dr. Patt to join us this evening.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for that introduction. And I just want to say what an honor it is for me to join you this evening and to follow the poignant and inspiring and moving remarks of Dr. Irwin Cotler. And I also want to say I'm so impressed seeing the video of the work that CHES has been able to accomplish over these years. And I recall fondly just 3 years ago when I was able to visit you in Ottawa in person, and I very much hope that I will be able to come back and do this in person soon. But for the time being, we'll have to make do with our world of Zoom. So I'm going to share my screen, and I actually have 2 things that I'd like to accomplish this evening in my remarks. One is to talk specifically about a new publication that has just come out in recent months that is called Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this new book that has come out that is very much aimed at this question that we've been discussing about how to teach the Holocaust in the 21st century, the imperative of Holocaust education in the 21st century. But as you can see in the image that I have on my cover slide, I also want to spend a few minutes at the end of my remarks this evening talking about what we're doing this evening, which is engaging in virtual memory of the Shoah amidst COVID-19, and for us to think a little bit about how this might transform the nature of Holocaust memory and education into the future. So I want to thank Mina so much for inviting me to be here this evening to speak about this new volume. And I'm pleased to share this new volume, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust, as well as reflecting on some of the challenges of sharing this history in our present moment. The timing of this volume, 75 years after the end of World War II, amidst the passing of the last generation of eyewitnesses to the devastation of that war, is critical. As my co-editor and I, Laura Hilton, finalized our book proposal in August of 2017, Nazis were literally marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." As we engaged with the first drafts of chapters, the New York Times released a report in April of 2018 that 41% of Americans and just over 2/3 of millennials, people aged 19 to 35, did not know what Auschwitz was, although 93% thought that students in school should learn about the Holocaust. And as we read through second drafts of chapters in October of 2018, a gunman entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, murdering 11, injuring 7, and desecrating a house of worship, the deadliest attack on a Jewish community in the United States history. And just as we held our virtual launch of the book, which we did this year on September 30th over Zoom, you can re-experience the virtual book launch on YouTube. As we held the virtual launch, the Claims Conference published a 50-state survey of states in the United States about what we can deem concerning levels of a lack of Holocaust knowledge among the youngest generation. Now, I should say that this is not to say that there are not incredibly dedicated educators committed to teaching the Holocaust. And yet we can see this data that points to shocking lack of knowledge of the Holocaust across the United States. And I just show you a map from some of this survey data, which shows you they did a state-by-state analysis of levels of Holocaust knowledge. And for example, you can see that all over the United States, millennials who were surveyed did not know that 6 million Jews were killed in Auschwitz, did not know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, did not know what Auschwitz was, could not name the name of a ghetto or a concentration camp. And I want to point out, just as an aside, that this survey, which showed all of the states in the United States and levels of Holocaust knowledge, there was no correlation between states that mandate Holocaust education and states that do not mandate Holocaust education. So states like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, Illinois, Florida had the same levels of lack of Holocaust knowledge. Those are all states that mandate Holocaust education as states that do not. And you can see, obviously, this is very concerning as we look forward into the 21st century and we think about a serious lack of not only knowledge of the Holocaust, but general historical knowledge altogether. The data is available online, the survey that was conducted by the Claims Conference. I'll just point out, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, that one of the most troubling aspects of this information is the percentage of millennials and Generation Z that have witnessed Holocaust denial or distortion on social media. Approximately 49% of millennials and Gen Z have seen Holocaust denial or distortion posts, and I suspect that it might be even higher. That is that rampant misinformation is available on all forms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we can discuss efforts to confront the denial that have belatedly been introduced only recently. So within this context, there is at the same time a great deal of desire and a recognition of the importance of continuing to teach about the Holocaust. So we have this disconnect, a lack of knowledge, but a recognition of the importance of teaching it. And I could see in the video that there is a similar sort of finding that you have seen in the work of CHES as well. So this volume that we have published is designed specifically to help those incredibly dedicated educators who are so committed to teaching the topic. Teaching the Holocaust commands an enormous amount of attention, but specific training to teach the Holocaust is not always readily available for those who teach it. And teaching the Holocaust, as we know, demands much more than a superficial understanding. Teachers must guide students through sensitive and often emotional subjects, mindful of grounding topics within their specific historical context, pushing beyond a shallow or incomplete explanation. And so this volume that we have published offers readers content knowledge and instructional strategies for educators to teach this vital history accurately, effectively, and thoughtfully. The first part of the book provides an overview of current scholarship on key topics of the Holocaust, and the second part of the book contains focused explanations on how to teach multiple types of representations of the Holocaust and how these understandings have changed in the past several decades. Chapters in each section combine content knowledge with pedagogical advice for educators seeking to bridge the gap between the sheer volume of information available and best practices in terms of teaching it. Now, one of the specific goals of the volume is to both serve as a starting point for educators new to teaching the Holocaust, but also to focus on teachers at multiple levels to integrate the teaching of the Holocaust into their classes and curricula. And in this respect, it answers a call to continue to build a bridge between scholars who specialize in researching and teaching the Holocaust and those who teach in a wide variety of classrooms. The chapters are written by seasoned educators from a wide variety of institutions and high schools who possess considerable experience and training. Now, in the volume, and I'll just take you through some of the specific focus in the volume, each chapter also tries to provide pedagogical suggestions for teachers on how to teach it. And each of the authors is a teacher and a scholar deeply immersed in scholarship and teaching in the classroom to a variety of students. So in the first part of the volume, you can see there are 11 chapters, each which focus on teaching a specific topic. Topics which deal with such critical topics as anti-Semitism, the long history of antipathy towards Jews, the question of how Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were able to rise to power, the Nazis' use of legislation as one of the primary tools used by the state to marginalize and exclude persecuted populations, including Jews and other targeted groups, and Jewish responses to Nazi persecution in Germany and Austria. Content chapters deal specifically with the period of the war, highlighting ways in which the Holocaust can be integrated into courses that are more general or World War II courses and vice versa. These include chapters on the Wehrmacht, the Nazi camp universe, the place of ghettos within Nazi persecution and economic exploitation, the intertwined issues of collaboration and complicity, and the continuum of Jewish and non-Jewish rescue and resistance to Nazi persecution of Jews across Europe. My own chapter in the volume looks at Jewish displaced persons in the aftermath of the Holocaust, highlighting the incredible resilience of the surviving population, but also asking us to extend beyond the typical date of 1945 in our teaching about the Holocaust, to look at the survivors and how they rebuilt life in the aftermath, also creating historical commissions focused on the documentation projects to make sure that the Holocaust would not be forgotten. The second part of, and here you can see one of the chapters deals with post-war justice as well. The second part of the volume consists of 9 chapters that capture the extensive array of representations that educators can use to teach the Holocaust, including literature, photography, testimony, film, museums, memorials, and more. Now, I'm going to switch gears for a moment, if you'll indulge me, because there is something completely unusual about what we're trying to do here this evening, this virtual memorialization project. And I do want to think a little bit about how this COVID-19 pandemic and our efforts to sort of facilitate virtual education, facilitate virtual commemoration, might indicate some changes that, and we can discuss this in the Q&A, that might affect us going into the future. Most basically, I want to think about what is the impact of the global pandemic on collective memory of the Shoah. And more broadly, I suppose this connects to an ongoing concern that I have with how we remember the Shoah in the 21st century. How do we use the present to understand the past? And how does the past help us to understand the present? Can we find any meaning in mass death, especially in a time when we confront the prospect of a global pandemic? The meaning of that memory has evolved over the past 75 years, while the Holocaust has become a cornerstone of contemporary Jewish identity. Nevertheless, even as paradoxically, distance from the event seems to demonstrate that the Shoah or Holocaust has become a more central component of contemporary both American Jewish, Israeli Jewish identity, and among Jewish communities around the world. The inability to convey the traumatic nature of this experience means that the memory of the event is constantly mediated and reformatted for social, cultural, and political purposes, while the true nature of the event still remains elusive. And so tonight we are gathered here on Kristallnacht, having a virtual Kristallnacht commemoration. But I want to take a moment to look at the commemorations that took place earlier this year, just about a month after we went into global lockdown, as we marked Yom HaShoah, roughly in April of this past year. In this year, as the global pandemic began to shut down the world, we observed Passover, marking seders and performing memory with immediate family only, or for some through virtual Zoom seders. And 2 weeks later, on Yom HaShoah, we marked the 75th anniversary of liberation with a spate of virtual commemorations all over the world, some of which attempted to recreate Holocaust commemorations using Zoom in real time, as we are in a sense doing this evening, and others which opted for asynchronous videos that could be observed in the comfort of one's home. These rituals still reinforced a divide between institutional memory and shaped by state actors. So you can see a Yom HaShoah commemoration organized by the Jewish Agency, but also by something called Zikaron Basalon, which tried to create more private forms of memory. And this was the April 2019 Zikaron Basalon, which doesn't look so COVID safe in the context of this year. What we can see, though, is that two tendencies seem to come together this year in virtual commemorations of COVID-19. Most of these commemorations were online attempts to perform the same rituals that marked Yom HaShoah events for years, both on April 19th and on the 27th of Nisan, which this year fell on April 21st. And these commemorations also continue to mark anxiety over the passing of the survivor generation, asking the question, as we have asked, how will we remember once the survivors are no longer with us? Who will remember for us? And I should note here, from the perspective of the United States, we have to think about how the anxiety of the present moment, which included in the United States the bizarre spectacle of right-wing nationalists invoking Nazi imagery to protest government attempts to keep them safe. This was from Michigan, protesting lockdowns that were taking place in Michigan. At the same time, these virtual commemorations invoked a desire for connection and an attempt to find solace in greater suffering from the past, spur even greater involvement in virtual commemorations than ever before. Jack Klieger, a child of survivors and president and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, noted in his remarks for Yom HaShoah organized by the Museum of Jewish Heritage that, quote, this year's virtual gathering of remembrance is, as he said, exactly the type of initiative that will carry Holocaust memory into the future. And indeed, the New York ceremony marked the 75th anniversary of liberation and combined remarks by dignitaries, survivors, and their descendants, music and videos from previous commemorations, and a recorded FaceTime call with Dr. Ruth. At Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, a ceremony with no audience and a solitary bugler in the Warsaw Ghetto Square commemorated this year's theme, Jews Saving Jews, which did not require much of a leap for those seeking to draw connections. In recorded remarks, the president of Israel, Ruvi Rivlin, argued that even though, quote, regrettably, we do not meet tonight in Warsaw Ghetto Square at Yad Vashem, as we do every year, we cannot let the threats of the present cloud the memory of the past, noting that it was the human spirit that vanquished the Holocaust. Rivlin brought his remarks fully into the present moment, explaining the solidarity and common obligation which to save Jews during the war meant. As he said, the current pandemic occupying the entire world, the war against a non-human, invisible, and indiscriminate foe, only emphasizes our common obligation to human solidarity, to mutual responsibility, and to the uncompromising battle against anti-Semitism and hatred, which also spread like an infectious disease from one to the other, unquote. And amidst the global pandemic, in a time of increased anxiety plus social distancing and the embrace of virtual technology, we could also see an continued attempt to find solace in virtual memories of survivors who demonstrated resilience. And as you can see here in this image, the New Dimensions and Testimony Project suggested provided evidence that we could achieve some form of immortality. And the timing of this was quite interesting. On April 5th, 2 weeks before Yom HaShoah, the famed CBS 60 Minutes program aired a story on the Shoah Foundation's New Dimensions and Testimony program, that they obviously had been working on for a long time before the COVID-19 pandemic, but which seemed to take on additional significance in the midst of the current crisis. Scott Pelley introduced the story by noting that it recalled another time when the world was convulsed by a global crisis. The Shoah Foundation, they suggested, had harnessed the technology of the present to continue speaking with the past. Leslie Stahl began the segment speaking with Aaron Elster, who survived 2 years in hiding in an attic, noting that, quote, "This was unlike any interview we'd ever done before. It wasn't the content that was so unusual, it was the fact that this interview was with a man who was no longer alive," unquote. Now, we can discuss all of this in the Q&A, but this still is an illusion mediated through many layers of distance, a virtual replica of a human speaking in a language that cannot adequately transmit the nature of the trauma, transporting us through time to a place that we do not want to be. And we can also discuss this, these virtual survivors, or not really holograms of survivors, is still one person's memory, which becomes a stand-in for the memory of millions. So instead of a focus on the memories, and you can think of anyone, let's say from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Anilevich, Klepfish, Edelman, Lubetkin, Zuckerman, will be left with the memories of the chosen survivors by the New Dimensions and Testimony Project, either Pinchas Gutter or Eva Kor and Aaron Elster, Eva Schloss, and 20 other virtual survivors and their artificial intelligence programs. Now, only time will tell what the impact of these projects will be in terms of how the next generation engages with virtual survivors. But even so, we are still distancing from the trauma of the Shoah. We relativize the trauma of the present by juxtaposing to the enormous trauma of the past. We continue to find meaning in the collective memory of the past that in some ways suits the needs of the present. And if we remember the trauma of the past, it is to say, today is not as bad. And if we seek a silver lining, it is for hope of resilience, communal solidarity, and collective obligation. Nonetheless, as I've suggested, when we view these virtual survivors, it's still an illusion which is mediated through many layers of distance, a virtual replica of a human speaking in a language that cannot adequately transmit the nature of the trauma. This is also, as I've suggested, one person's memory. And so we are left with the challenge. How will we remember something that we never personally experienced? And how will we convey any meaningful lessons to the next generation, mediated by time, cyberspace, and growing distance, especially as it becomes easier, sorry, I'll stop my share, especially as it becomes easier to deny and doubt the past. This, I suspect, will be the central challenge of Holocaust education in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patt. A fascinating look at some of your work, and you raise such important questions. We certainly have time for a Q&A. A reminder to anybody who has a question for either of our speakers to hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question. We have one question for Dr. Patt already, which I'll read, but please feel free to throw some more in there. Because a reminder, the audience can't see these questions, just the panelists. So I'll read our first question tonight to Dr. Patt. Does your book include educating students about anti-Semitism from the left? This is very timely, as openly anti-Semitic members of the Squad have just been reelected and are glorified by young people in the United States, Canada, and around the world as progressive, quote unquote, progressive voices. They have been known to say things such as boycotting Israel is no different from boycotting Nazi Germany, among many other openly anti-Jewish and anti-Israel statements. Please elaborate.
Okay. So what I will say is that, sorry, let me just close that. What I'll say is that the first chapter of the book is a chapter by Jonathan Ellikin, who is a professor at Trinity College and an expert on medieval Jewish history. And it's an analysis of anti-Semitism and a broad historical analysis of anti-Semitism. And that is that Professor Ellikin traces the transformations of anti-Semitism from antiquity all the way to the present, but also asks us to think critically about how we teach both anti-Semitism. I might actually be curious to hear what Professor Cotler thinks about this too. How we teach about anti-Semitism, and also how we use the Holocaust to teach about anti-Semitism. That is, there's a question which is, we have to teach about anti-Semitism, and I agree with some of what is stated there, which is that when we teach about anti-Semitism, we have to teach about all contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism. That's anti-Semitism that comes in the form of white nationalism, anti-Semitism of the alt-right, and anti-Semitism that comes on the left, and anti-Semitism that manifests itself in anti-Zionism and calls to boycott Israel. I mean, but one of the challenges of teaching about anti-Semitism, as the question suggests, is that it is an incredibly malleable ideology that can sort of be shaped to many different political needs. One of the challenges in terms of, and I wonder about the effectiveness about, yes, we can use Holocaust education to teach and make sure that people remember about the Holocaust. And we can use Holocaust education to teach about the dangers of anti-Semitism that runs rampant and becomes state ideology and state practice to first create the social death of the Jewish population, then become unleashed across the European continent. But I don't think that we can only use teaching about the Holocaust to teach about the dangers of contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. That is, that we have to face directly all the multiple forms of anti-Semitism and teach about that too, if that makes sense. Not just use the Holocaust to talk about the dangers of anti-Semitism, but to engage with contemporary forms of anti-Semitism directly. And I'm sure Professor Cotler has thoughts about how to do this well too.
Oh, Professor Cotler, may you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, I think Avinoam has given a very good response. I think one of the things we're facing with regard to the anti-Semitism from the quote-unquote progressives is where anti-Semitism is laundered under the cover of anti-racism, or is laundered under the cover of progressivism, and where sort of Jews are excluded from the framework of argument on the grounds that they are the white privileged class. And I remember some students who visited us some years ago with BDS movement first surfaced in its intensity on the campus, and they said, we know all the arguments against BDS. It's not that we're uninformed. We know the arguments. The problem is that we are not seen in the campus culture as having standing to even make the argument, that we are excluded from being part of the argument because we are seen as being part of the oppressor class rather than part of the oppressed class. And so the phenomenon or dynamics of intersectionality, where all the victims, so to speak, of racism come together against all the oppressors, but where the Jew, and this is particularly prominent in the campus culture, where progressivism is in fact affirming itself, are, as I said, not given standing to be part of the debate. So I think it's our responsibility to unmask and expose whenever anti-Semitism comes forward in any guise, whether it be from the far right or white supremacism, or whether it be on the far left on progressivism, or whether it becomes simply normalized as part of the mainstream culture. It's our responsibility to unmask and expose it and make it clear that while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews.
Thank you. And I have another question for Dr. Patt. In speaking about the recent survey by the Claims Conference, Dr. Patt said that although some states in the United States mandate the teaching of the Holocaust, nevertheless, approximately the same level of lack of knowledge was demonstrated by the people surveyed. This certainly shows the need for continued teaching of the Holocaust, but does it also show that that may not be enough? Perhaps the mandate was only recently started. How can we ensure that the teaching that's done is actually effective?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm glad that the questioner brought this up. There was for a number of years, and I'd say for about the last 25 years or so, sort of the major push, at least here in the United States, was to enact state mandates, right? That if it's mandated, then we've accomplished something by making sure that at least it's taught. And as I suggested, one of the concerning things there is that there's no correlation between states that require it and levels of knowledge. That doesn't mean, and I think, rightfully so, I've heard some pushback from educators who say, no, in my school, right, I teach the Holocaust and I do it quite well. And every student who graduates from, my high school, teachers have said to me, in fact, one of the contributors to this volume, Stuart Abrams, who teaches in Avon, Connecticut, says there's not one student who graduates from Avon High School who will not know, what is Auschwitz, or will not know that 6 million Jews died during the Holocaust. What I think this points out is how uneven the education is, right? That just because there's a state mandate, there are some teachers who are incredibly passionate about it and will seek out all of the resources that they can from all of the entities and institutions that they can to be able to teach it. And then there are some schools that simply do not have the resources to do this, whether or not there's a mandate in place in that state. I think, one of the issues that we have here is that, and I'll speak specifically about the state of Connecticut, where we passed a mandate in the year 2018. And I'm happy that we passed a mandate. The sort of political winds were here, where we had concerning levels of rising anti-Semitism. A lot of people were worried about sort of the political shifts that were happening here in the United States and a trend to the right. And I think this helped us get the mandate passed. But as happens in many states, it was passed in a climate of budget restrictions. So they say we can pass a mandate, but no resources were really provided for teachers for how to do it. And this is where, I think the work of CHES is so important, because yes, you can say it's important, and yes, you can say, right, there's a requirement to teach it, but without the proper resources and without the proper training, what good is a mandate? So this is one of the concerns. And then the only other thing I'll add is that it so happens that the Claims Conference conducted this survey to sort of assess levels of historical knowledge, and it's incredibly concerning. What I would say is that I think this is a reflection of a broader lack of historical knowledge in general, right? So that if you surveyed students and asked them about other historical events, they probably, wouldn't do very well on surveys about those other historical events. What worries me is the level of Holocaust denial and distortion, which is rampant and available online, which is, you had Deborah Lipstadt speak just last year. She is brilliant on this point about the ways in which anti-Semites will use Holocaust denial to further their agenda, right? And we are living in a time, and with the internet and with Facebook, where it's so much easier for the deniers to spread their message. It's so much easier for the anti-Semites to spread their message. And this is what worries me, right? That there are not sort of verified forms of information that students can turn to. And this is where it becomes even more challenging for educators to do their work.
Thank you. And just wondering, Professor Cotler, if you wanted to weigh in on any of that from the Canadian side?
No, I think, it would be good if we could have some empirical data on what is the situation here in Canada. I think the Claims Conference did very important work and gave us a broad spectrum appreciation of what is happening in the States and various states in the United States. We need to have some of that data here in Canada. It would be good both for comparative purposes, and it would be good so that we can have a sense of what needs to be done here within an evidence-based framework.
Thank you. Another question for Dr. Patt, which begins with, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about the role of descendants of Holocaust survivors in teaching our young people. I see descendants as being able to express the impact that this horror had on survivors, with the trade-off being that their ability to convey a survivor's story is less than ideal.
Right. So this is another excellent question. And I think we're seeing, we're seeing a lot of this, right? All over the world, this sort of question of what is the role that descendants can play, and, children, grandchildren, second generation, third generation, what's the role that they can play in the future of Holocaust education? And this is actually, I've done some work with this locally where we've interviewed children of survivors, and I think it's fascinating because one of the interesting things is to compare the ways in which this will be done differently in different parts of the world, right? So you have certain communities which have large populations of survivors and large cohorts then of descendants of survivors, right? So Montreal, I think, is an interesting example of that. Melbourne in Australia is an interesting example of that. Israel, there's places where you have survivor populations that are very prominent in the community, and then children of survivors who I think will play an important role compared to other parts of the world where it's interesting. I think one of the things, right, and Marianne Hirsch as a scholar has worked a lot on this, is that so memory, right, when it's transferred from one generation to the next, is mediated, and there's a transfer that takes place, and she talks about it as post-memory. And so, I don't think that we can ever necessarily expect the children of survivors to take on their parents, nor would we want them to take on their parents' memories and share them, as their own, right? They belong to their parents. But what I think is so interesting, and what I've seen to be really effective, is for children of survivors to go into classrooms and talk about what it was like to grow up as the child of a survivor, right? How did it impact their own identity? How did it shape their own development? When did they first learn about it? What did their parents talk about it? Did they not talk about it, right? And as we know, in each family, this functions very differently in different families. So in some families, the parents talked about it all the time. In some families, they never talked about it, right? And so I think some of it is sort of figuring out how it has impacted one's own development, and then how that affects the way that it is conveyed. I think there is no doubt that the children and grandchildren of survivors, just as survivors were the ones who wanted to make sure that Jewish communities around the world listened to them, right? Heard their stories and made it part of, right? Because think about in the early post-war years, the degree to which it wasn't communicated, and survivors played such an important role in playing and establishing these organizations. I think that it's the children and grandchildren of survivors who will continue to play that role in pushing Holocaust education and commemoration to the forefront of the communal agenda, right? It's going to have to continue be from one generation to the next, something that each generation will do.
Thank you. And just a reminder to our participants, we have a couple of minutes left for questions. If you do have one, please submit your question by clicking on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Another question for Professor Patt, could you please elaborate on virtual testimonies and virtual memory and the mediation of memory through these new forms of technology? And do you think this will become the norm after the pandemic with the passing of survivors?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. So this, I'm really interested in this new technology, obviously, that the Shoah Foundation has created. And, that for those of you, I don't know how many people have seen it or interacted with this new technology. It's really interesting. You can go into a museum space and you see sort of a life-size survivor on a screen in front of you, and they're sitting there, and it uses artificial intelligence, and they've recorded hundreds of hours of testimony, which is in a computer, and then the computer sort of interprets your question and then replays the appropriate segment from that hundreds of hours of testimony to answer your question. So it's really fascinating, right? And it sort of involves machine learning, and over time the computer gets better and better. But of course, this is not real, and this cannot replace a survivor and the engagement with a survivor. And yet there is something uncanny about it in terms of the way in which you interact, because you feel like you're facing a real person. And so one of the concerns that I have, I think in some way it works quite well. The Shoah Foundation chose about 25 survivors that they wanted to sort of be the prototypical survivors, people who had all sorts of different experiences. And I worry about the degree to which these will become sort of the 21st century survivors, right? And we will lose the component of, survivors who moved, for example, to Ottawa and became part of that community. And this is where I think the local work is so important, right? In terms of recording those testimonies, in terms of children of survivors sharing those testimonies, because yes, if you go to a museum, it's a way for a student to encounter, a virtual survivor, but it can't replace that real experience. But I think we're going to see, I mean, people are fascinated by this technology. We're going to see more and more of it because people will want to sort of live on, become immortal in a sense. And so I think we're going to see more and more use of this technology.
Thank you. Our next question is for both of our speakers. I know education is deficient in many places and not in the right context. Can Professor Cotler or Professor Patt comment on the angle and context of Holocaust education and the universality of discrimination, the universality of discrimination view with which it tends to be delivered? It is not a never again for Jews, but how that could be made to reflect on the quality of Holocaust education. Whichever of you would like to go first.
Go ahead.
I'll defer to Avinoam, given his particular expertise as a scholar here.
Okay, I'll start, and then I'd love for you to chime in as well. So I think one of the questions, if I understand correctly here, and I'm just going to see if I can pull it up as well, it's not a never again for Jews, but how that could be made to reflect on the quality of, and particularly in the context. So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, one of the questions also has to do with sort of Holocaust education as a paradigm for sort of teaching about discrimination, for teaching, and I think this also relates to comparative genocide as well. And I'll say, I think obviously in Holocaust, we sort of tend to lump these two together, Holocaust and genocide education. And certainly when the legislation is passed, it's usually about Holocaust and genocide education. I will say that I think this, like the imperative for Holocaust education, functions differently in different contexts, right? So, for survivors after the Holocaust, the imperative, as Professor Cotler suggested, the imperative of Zachor meant something very specific, right? Which is Zachor et asher aseh lecha Amalek, but it was in a very sort of Jewish context, that this obligation of memory to memorialize families that had been lost, this obligation to make sure that they would never be forgotten, but also because the survivors who had survived felt that they had this obligation that why did I survive? I need to make sure that people don't forget. And I think in Israel, Holocaust education, comes to play like a very important role in sort of the national identity of Israel in a way that it functions very differently from how Holocaust education efforts. And now I'm just talking about how the Jewish community presents itself vis-a-vis the surrounding community, right? As part of becoming either American or becoming Canadian. It means something very different in terms of Holocaust education, in terms of becoming American or Canadian, than it does within the Jewish community. I think we have to be sensitive to those differences, right? So for Jews, we can think about like this sacred obligation of memory. We can think about it in a religious context, but that's very different from a public education context. And I think it's the same thing, right? For each genocide, part of the genocide is to destroy the civilization that existed. And I think that's one of the imperatives of genocide education, is to make sure that we remember and we respect that civilization that was attempted to be destroyed. But it's a sacred obligation for each group, and it's a sacred obligation for the surrounding society to remember and to respect. And I have no idea if I answer the question, but maybe Professor Cotler can also jump in and try to offer some thoughts.
Well, I think this has been always an ongoing challenge. How do we, on the one hand, preserve the uniqueness and the integrity of the Holocaust, and yet convey the universality of its lessons? I mean, the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, in the same way that anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. And I think the teachings of Elie Wiesel preserved both the integrity and uniqueness of the Holocaust, as well as the universality of its lessons. As he would always say, that he will never, compare anything to the Holocaust, so as to not in any way diminish the uniqueness and integrity of the horror of horrors. But there were universal lessons that one could draw from it, such as that indifference and inaction always means coming down on the side of the victimizer, not on the side of the victim, or that silence in the face of evil is complicity with evil itself. And so while the Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, the dangers of silence in the face of evil are a universal lesson. So I always found that the teachings of Wiesel are amongst the best, if not the best, in terms, as I say, preserving the integrity of Holocaust remembrance on the one hand, and the universality of its lessons on the other.
Thank you. And we have run out of time for questions this evening. I apologize to those who had questions that weren't able to be answered. It always shows me what kind of interest we have in our speakers, or in what our speakers have to say when we run out of time before we run out of questions. So thank you so much to both of you for sharing your insights and your time and answering the questions that we were able to take this evening. As we close for tonight, I would like to tell you about two other programs that CHES has planned for Holocaust Education Month. Please join us 1 week from tonight, except not tonight, it's in the afternoon. That's November 5th at 1 o'clock for another virtual first, the launch of the virtual pop-up museum. Many of you may remember our previous pop-up museum, and you also saw it featured in the film. So on November 15th with the Zelikovic Center, we have two guest speakers on the importance of artifacts to Holocaust research, and we'll also hear from community members who will share some personal stories about items belonging to their families. And then on Wednesday, November 18th at 7 in the evening, CHES and the Zelikovic Center invite you to Relations, Resistance, Resilience, a collaborative workshop with librarians and curators from the Jewish Public Library and the Montreal Holocaust Museum, a fascinating evening exploring some rare books and objects from their collection. You can find more information about both of those virtual events on our website. And in closing tonight, I would like to give a very special thank you to Mina Cohen. I know many of you know that without Mina, we wouldn't be here tonight. Mina works tirelessly for CHES on all kinds of projects. I know she really poured her heart into the film that you all watched here tonight. And Mina, we're so thankful for all of your work. Thank you to Mina. I hope to see all of you next Sunday. Thank you so much for joining us, and good night.